Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gerald Murphy. I'm the founder of the School Mock Court Case program, which has been running since 2008, and also the chair of the Board of Trustees. Welcome to the second debate on the Should We Rid the World of Plastics? We have two speakers this week, Doug Skinner from Greenpeace and Amy Meek from Kids Against Plastics. Before I get them started, a couple of things if I can. We are having problems with our server in Germany at the moment. It's not allowing webcams to work, so I can only apologize, but the PowerPoints are working okay, as indeed is sound. During the course of the week, we set up what's called Hangout Rooms. This enables students to log on whenever they wish. They can go to their own Hangout room. Only they can access that Hangout room, and that's where they can start debating the topic and the various lectures. This will be also useful for students who are not together. Now, a number of the students who are taking part in this year's program are individual students. They're not part of a school, although have been authorized by their school. So, for example, some of the schools in Scotland will now have assigned to their team students from across Europe or further afield. In all, there are 14 countries taking part in this debate. So please use the Hangout Rooms for that. However, to speak to them initially and also to speak to us, we're using what's called the forum. When you sign in, you'll see at your top menu, you have a link to go to the forum. You have to sign back in to get to the forum. That's where we will put important messages and also links to the recording of all the debates. So if you missed the debate last week or wish to watch it again from Dr. Garrett, the link is in and on the forum. Today we're trying a new technology. We're using live streaming by YouTube. The link for that is on Facebook. So for the teachers who are on at the moment, if there are other students who are not part of the debate program but would like to see and hear the lectures, they can watch it live through the YouTube, and as I say, the link is on Facebook, or that link will be popped up on the forum once the recording has been finished. I'm not going to hold you back any longer than that. I'm going to now ask Mr. Skinner from Greenpeace to speak to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me along to give this talk this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to wish happy birthday to Albo. It seems that his birthday today, so hope you have a great evening tonight. Should we rid the world of plastics? Well, I don't think we should rid the whole world of all plastics. I think that's like saying that all food is bad. We know which food is bad for us and which is good. I'm going to talk today about some of the problems with some of the plastics that we need to be aware about. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Sorry for the delay. Got used to the system now, so it's all systems go. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Greenpeace, why Greenpeace is qualified to give advice on this subject. I started with Greenpeace as a volunteer some 50 years ago, so a few years older than a lot of you there. I started as a scuba diver, I did a marine biology degree, and in the 50 years since, I've seen destruction of the seas and the seas filling up with plastic. So one of my passions is how are we going to clean up the sea and what are we going to do. So Greenpeace started in 1971 by initially trying to stop, and very successfully stopping, atmospheric nuclear testing in the Pacific regions, particularly islands like Bikini Island, which was contaminating the atmosphere and contaminating the seas. We were able to sort of put ships in that area and stop it all going on. We also stopped clubbing of seals. The numbers went down from 30 million to 1 million, and we stopped that. And we were quite responsible for stopping the wholesale slaughter of whales around the world. So I think that's where we all started. But we're interested in the environment from all aspects of the environment. Just to give you a little idea of what we do. What we do, we're about bearing witness. We want to show people what's going on. We want to bring out the truth and let people see. We're totally independent of any organization, any government. We're totally non-violent. We get training on non-violence, and that's the best way to get change. We promote radical change to become a more sustainable society. We do a lot of scientific research so that we can provide sensible solutions, and hopefully we can provide some sensible solutions on what we're doing on plastics at the moment. So it's all related to oil. Oil is the feedstuff for making plastics. We all know about the link between carbon dioxide coming from oil in its various forms. Plastic, it's one of its forms. And the temperature of the environment and global warming effect. As it goes at the moment, we are going to be creeping up from more than 1.5 degrees C increase in temperature. And if we're not careful, it could go up to 4 degrees C. And we need to do a lot of work to stop that happening, a lot of work. One of the problems that we have is plastic. And plastic comes from oil, and ultimately it will be burnt, or it will break down in the environment and eventually end up in the seas or the waterways, and ultimately will end up in our food chain. There's masses of plastics that are being burnt at the moment, and that's what we need to do. The problem is not all plastics. It's like anything, there's no simple solution. There's no, we don't just ban everything because some part of it is bad. The section of plastics that we need to really worry about is reusable, is disposable, single-use plastics. And what we should be doing, like in anything we produce, we should have a precautionary principle before we do anything. And that has not been applied to plastics. And what happens is we end up with plastics mountains all over the world. And there's a huge amount of plastics virtually everywhere we look. And there's actually no need for these. There's no need for these bottles in this pile. Every Western country that's got a good water supply, we can have reusable bottles made out of metal or reusable plastic. We just don't need to be adding to that plastics mountain. So it's just ease of use to buy a plastic bottle when you're out. But it's just a matter of that thought, a little extra thought in trying to stop reusable plastics. We see plastics being used for really ridiculous uses, like artificial grass in gardens. I mean, killing everything underneath it, and eventually all of that plastic will either degrade into the soil and ultimately into waterways and sea, and end up in our food chain. And that's what I want to try and demonstrate today. That everything that we do in plastics will end up in our body if we're not careful. So, things like plastic bags, they should have been banned some time ago. Some countries have actually totally banned plastic bags like this. Even the new heavy-duty plastic bags, they're still disposed of. They're still virtually single-use, and they end up in mountains in waste, or they end up being burned. So there's no need for it when we've got good reusable bags that can be made out of hemp or other sustainable products. So the one thing we need to be aware about plastic, it's all dominated by the oil industry. So the oil industry at the moment, because they realize that petrol will be going down as we go towards electric cars and autonomous cars, they're investing in plastic production themselves with the idea of producing much more plastic. And we have to be careful about this and make sure that, yes, there are good plastics out there, but single-use plastics have to be avoided, and we need to do something about it. One of the problems with this is that it all ends up being burnt or dumped in the ground, both of which will end up causing us a massive problem. Now, at the end of that process are incinerators. The British government has said that they are given permission for 100 incinerators across the UK. They're usually built in deprived areas because the toxic materials that come from them are all breathed in. The owners of these incinerators will say that it's nice, clean energy providing 300 jobs, but what they don't tell you is that people that live around those areas do have health problems, breathing health problems because of all the toxics that come into the air that we're breathing. And of course, if they're perched near the sea, it will go into the food chain. And if you eat fish, eventually it will get into a human body. Likewise, from the local dumps, the local waste dumps, eventually they all dissolve, break down, and end up in particles in the sea. And that's our food chain. We are part of that food chain, whether we like it or not. We will be involved with that food chain, and from the top to the bottom, every part of our environment has got microplastics of some sort or other. Whether you're up a mountain, whether you're in the Arctic or Antarctic or the bottom of the sea, there's microplastics. There's also a huge amount of nets and other waste products floating around the world. Now, all of these are going to break down. This is a very good example. This is the Sargasso Sea. It's a sea which goes round and round in circles. It's supposed to be an ocean dump, because what you see when you go there is an accumulation of plastics from all over the world. It just goes round and round in circles, and of course breaking up as it does into smaller parts, ending up in the food chain, whether it's in turtles or fish. And you know, we've all seen these horrible pictures of a lot of this. Most of that plastic you see from that whale is single-use plastic, and that's the sort of plastic that we need to be stopping. And you see, you know, birds like these albatross picking up bits of plastic thinking it's food, and most of those things you can see there are single-use plastics. Plastics is good for, you know, a number of products in cars or medicine, but we do need to get rid of single-use plastics. There's no need for it at all. What's happening is all the plastic's breaking down into very, very small particles, and it's ending up in fish. It's ending up being part of the food chain. Now, this is a beautiful little part of the algae, the algal part of the food chain. It's where everything starts, really. So they photosynthesize, they use the sun to create sugars and proteins, and this is another one here, desmids and diatoms they're called, and they're right at the bottom of the food chain. And then along comes the plankton, microplankton. I mean, a lot of these you'd have to look at them under the microscope to see how small they are. This is this one here, copepod, goes up and down in the seas like a wildebeest, chasing all of these algae. And it's probably about 85% of plankton is this particular animal. It's a crustacean, a relative of the crab and the lobster. And what it does, it filters. It uses little setae, little fingers on the side to filter the plankton as its food. 85% of plankton is this particular organism, and they have been demonstrated by Plymouth Marine Research Association to be eating microplastic. Now, what's the impact of this? This is human sperm cells, and what I'm trying to show you is there is a link between plastic, the amount of plastic in the sea and around the world, either being burnt or dissolved in the sea, and sperm counts, human sperm counts, and they've been going down by 56% since 1970. Now, that is a huge problem for the fertility, and the main reason for that is a lot of the breakdown products of plastics mimic hormones. they're called endocrine disruptors. Hormones in the body are produced by the endocrine system, so they're endocrine disruptors, and this is a major problem for the human race, alongside other chemicals which are causing this problem. I mentioned that plastic's been found in all parts of the world. It's all recently also been found in the placenta, human placenta. So it is everywhere. It's toxic, it sticks to toxic materials, and those toxic materials will be traveling around in our bodies. So we should have had a precautionary principle before releasing all of these products into the atmosphere, into the either atmosphere or into the sea. And we should be getting companies that are producing single-use plastic materials. They should be paying to clean this up. And there's absolutely no need for disposable plastic bottles, absolutely no need for single-use materials. There's alternatives for all of these. So that's my message. Not all plastics are bad, but we really do need to eliminate the single-use plastics because, yes, they are affecting us. They're getting into our bodies, and they will be causing damage, more and more damage. So that's my talk over. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you from Greenpeace too.
Doug, thank you very much for that very informative talk. Being from New Zealand, of course, I know of Greenpeace and, of course, that Rainbow Warrior in Auckland, but perhaps more about that another time. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll introduce you now to Amy Meek from Kids Against Plastic.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here and to be speaking to you all. And thank you, Doug, for your really informative talk as well. And I'd also like to start by, of course, wishing happy birthday to Alba as well. I hope you have a great day. And thank you for taking some of your time to come and listen to a talk on plastic pollution. You know, I appreciate that's not a conventional way to spend your birthday. So thanks very much for coming. So thank you, Doug, for taking us through some of the impacts that plastic has on the environment in particular. I am now going to be focusing more on the consumer side to the plastic pollution issue, as well as what some of the possible solutions might be to look to and the changes that we can make to address this global crisis. So my name is Amy. I am 17 years old, and I am the co-founder of an environmental youth-led charity called Kids Against Plastic. Now, I've been an active campaigner against plastic pollution since about the age of 12, when I started Kids Against Plastic with my younger sister Ella, after we discovered the really devastating impact that single-use plastics are having on the environment, as you've just heard from Doug. And in the last 5 years that we've been campaigning as part of our charity, we've encouraged over 1,000 schools and over 50 businesses, cafes and councils around the UK to become what we call plastic clever and to be more discerning users of single-use plastics. And we've also picked up over 90,000 pieces of plastic litter out of our 100,000 goal. So that's one for every sea mammal killed by plastic in the oceans every year. And we've also developed an app to log it. And finally, we've spoken at various locations around the UK and Europe about reducing plastic consumption, including all 3 parliaments in Great Britain, TEDx Exeter, and the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. So after all this, you know, it might be a bit surprising to you that I'm going to kick off my talk to you by saying that I agree with Doug. I don't think that plastic is bad. And this might sound like a bit of a contradiction because our charity is called Kids Against Plastic, after all. But I think I'll agree with some of the other speakers that, you know, you'll probably hear from Highland Spring and the plastic advocates, really, on one thing, that plastic is not inherently bad. It's revolutionized our lives in many ways, and it's made hospitals more sterile. It's given us almost unbreakable bowls, chairs, other household items, and it's become essential in the lives of people with medical conditions that rely on it to eat and to drink. However, what I do think is incredibly bad is when we are using plastic for purposes not as important as those I've just said. So in particular, for unnecessary single-use purposes, because we're taking an extremely durable synthetic material that lasts for hundreds of years, and we're using it to make items that we use for just 10 minutes before discarding, such as a plastic bottle. And, you know, it's not really rocket science to see why this mismatch of packaging and function is causing an environmental crisis that is rapidly spiraling out of control. Now, we produce 15 million plastic bottles alone per year in the UK, and every single one of these single-use plastic items we produce is still on the planet due to plastic's practically indestructible nature. It's super durable, except for items that are incinerated. And plastic items in the environment can take hundreds of years to break down, and even then they don't go away. They just exist as increasingly smaller microplastics, which cause even more problems, as we've just heard in Doug's talk. So this really begs the question, just how did we manage to get into this situation? And how did we manage to dig ourselves into a hole this big? And why do we just keep on digging? Well, let's rewind back to 2004 and let's have a look at when Coca-Cola first tried to sell bottled water to the UK public. Now, Coke's water brand, Dasani, had been very successful in the United States, and the corporation decided it wanted to try and hook its claws into the UK market. And really, it didn't have the outcome that they desired. The bottled water actually got laughed out of the supermarkets by the public, who were comparing it to an episode of a UK comedy programme called Only Fools and Horses, where the characters try to sell London tap water in bottles called Peckham Spring Water. So Coke ended up withdrawing the product from the UK after a really disastrous PR campaign, and it made the list of all-time marketing disasters compiled by a team of European branding experts. And the consultancy even said that Coke had ignored its customers' common sense by trying to sell this bottled water. Now, this is for good reason, because bottled water is, in many cases, actually just filtered tap water, and yet it is more expensive per litre than petrol, and it can be 2,000 times the cost of water from the tap. So why does it make any sense to buy it in a country where tap water is actually perfectly safe to drink? So companies like Coke had some big problems to face, but they weren't just going to give up yet. After all, the sales of soda at the time were plateauing, and they needed to try and find another market to profit off. And bottled water was just the solution. So through a series of adverts, misinformation campaigns that persuaded the public to question whether tap water was actually safe to drink in the first place, and also through some very clever branding that promoted the purity and the natural roots of bottled water, these bottled water companies slowly but surely manufactured a demand for their water, a demand that is still going strong today. Nestle Water even advertised that bottled water is the most environmentally responsible consumer product in the world. Now, 15 years later, that's a statement that's pretty hard to believe when you look out on an ocean that's accumulating 12 million tons of single-use plastic per year. And it's not just the end of life of plastic items that is incredibly damaging for the environment. Single-use plastics are polluting all throughout their life cycle. Now, it starts with manufacturing. Petroleum plastic, which is the type that we see on the shelves, is a synthetic polymer that's made from oil along with a concoction of chemicals. And polymers in, my slides seem to have been a bit messed up, but polymers in plastics are basically very long chains of predominantly carbon and hydrogen, although different molecules can be substituted to create different types of plastic. And the length of these chains make them really strong, and also means that they don't decompose in water, which is great for packaging things like bread. It's not so great when it's floating on the ocean as pollution. Now, it's also worth noting here that the chemicals used in plastic actually aren't great for our health either, because like Doug said, toxins from plastic can interfere with our bodies, and there was one particularly bad chemical that was used in plastic until very recently called bisphenol A, or BPA for short. Now, many experts say that BPA can interfere with our hormones, and it's been linked to health problems like diabetes and heart disease. And even there was a report that came out recently that said that BPA has been linked to the falling sperm counts that Doug mentioned, and that by 2045, there could be a 0 sperm count, which is pretty worrying things to hear. Now, that's why its use has actually been restricted in items for babies and young people in many countries around the world. But there are actually lots of other chemicals used in the manufacture of plastics that can be bad for our health if large amounts of them enter our bodies. Now, have you ever left your plastic bottle in a car on a hot day and it starts to taste a little bit weird? Well, what you're actually tasting is some of the chemicals from the plastic leaching into your drink because of the heat of the car. Not a particularly nice thing to hear. But it's actually the use of oil to make plastics that is one of the most damaging parts of plastic manufacture, because most petroleum plastics, which is the type that we most commonly see on the shelves, are made from crude oil or feedstocks that come from its refinery. Now, oil, as you may well know, is a fossil fuel, and that means that it is non-renewable, and we could well run out of it if we keep using it at current rates. Now, despite this, fossil fuels represent 99% of plastic's raw base material, which means that between 4% and 8% of global oil production is used just to make plastic. And current projections suggest that by 2050, plastic's share of global oil use will be around 20%. And oil refineries are also the second highest ranked sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per facility, behind only the power plant, meaning that plastic production also has a really big carbon footprint. And it's estimated that by 2050, plastic will be responsible for up to 13% of the world's carbon budget. Now, after production, plastic items are obviously then transported, which releases more carbon dioxide, and then they're sold to us consumers. Now, we then discard these items, and there are a few different ways that plastic can then end its life. One such way is litter, which Doug has really clearly explained to you the impacts of. The next is then incineration. Now, incineration is the burning of materials in a controlled environment to produce energy. And according to the British Plastics Federation, used plastics have a higher calorific value than coal, which is basically a fancy way of saying that they release more energy when burned. But actually, incineration has some serious flaws to it as well. So for a start, the US waste incinerators in 2016 released the equivalent of 12 million tons of carbon dioxide, more than half of which came just from burning plastics. And incineration also means that millions more plastic items need to be produced just to replace those that were used and burned the day before. The next alternative is then landfill. Now, due to its durable nature, plastic sits in landfill for hundreds of years, and when it comes into contact with rainwater, it starts to leach the chemicals contained in it into the water, which can then flow into rivers and oceans to contaminate the water there. Plus, as you probably know, plastic is super light, so it often blows out of waste collection vehicles or even landfill sites themselves to become litter in the environment. And finally, the method of disposing of plastics that we often see hailed as the solution by governments, companies, and consumers alike: recycling. Now, in theory, recycling is the perfect way to deal with our waste materials, because after all, in concept, recycling is basically using an old item like a plastic bottle to make a brand new plastic bottle again. And this is what's called closed loop recycling. Unfortunately, though, most of the recycling processes around the world aren't closed loop. So for a start, over half of the plastic we produce each year is single use. This means that it tends to be too low grade and flimsy to actually be recycled into a new product. The remaining plastic that can be recycled even in theory, such as PET plastic, which is used to make plastic bottles, is then downcycled into items of less worth than before, such as carpets or fleeces. Now, this brings along a whole other array of issues in the form of microplastic and microfiber pollution. Now, over 60% of our clothes now are made from plastics, such as this downcycled plastic, and this means that they shed things called plastic microfibers. Now, every time you or I put a synthetic garment in our washing machine, we're releasing potentially thousands of these microscopic particles, which are smaller than a human hair, into the waterways, due to the water treatment companies' inability to filter what are such tiny, tiny threads. In fact, it's estimated that a population of 100,000 people would produce approximately 1.02 kilograms of fibers each day. And with microfibers weighing such tiny amounts, you can kind of start to see the scale of this problem. Now, as you can see from these photos, I've actually done my own research into this. and I found that plastic garments, in particular polyester fleeces, shed around 1,096 milligrams of fibers in just an average wash. I also then filtered the local wastewater, the effluent from the local wastewater treatment plant near where we live, and I found microfibers washing into our local river even after extensive treatment. And perhaps most worryingly, I also filtered tap water using only a paper coffee filter and found microfibers in the water there. Now, microfibers are becoming an increasingly worrying and widespread issue because they've even been found in the most remote locations on Earth, including the Mariana Trench, Arctic sea ice, and mountain ranges like the Rocky Mountains and the Pyrenees. And their effects are still a bit uncertain, but they've been linked to stunted growth in the common crab and have been found to infiltrate the tissue of our lungs when we breathe them in from the air. So it looks like recycling, or should I say downcycling, isn't quite what it's made out to be. But despite the fact that our old plastic items aren't commonly being made into new ones, we still see plastic manufacturers pushing the recyclability of their products. Because in theory, a plastic Coke bottle could be made into a brand new one, but this doesn't often happen. And as long as their consumers continue to be misled into thinking that buying plastic and recycling it is a really sustainable process, then these companies can keep using it as a scapegoat while they pump out millions and millions more plastic items a day. The good news is, this is starting to change. So I took these photos in my local supermarket just this weekend. Companies like Evian are starting to use 100% recycled plastic in their bottles, which is a step in the right direction. But we need to see this adopted by corporations across the board in order for it to make a significant difference. And that's going to be a hard change to push for when corporations like Coca-Cola have been reported to make more money from producing new plastic bottles than the actual drinks themselves. Most corporations just don't have the financial incentive to transition from new plastic to recycled plastic, and so are unlikely to do so in the near future unless pushed to by government legislation and regulations. Ultimately, the only way that recycling will come close to being a solution to plastic pollution is when it is closed loop and accompanied by better waste infrastructure, improved packaging design, and perhaps most importantly, a reduction in the amount of single-use plastic we use in the first place. So on that note, how do we make a shift away from a reliance of single-use plastic, and what are the alternatives? So one option would just be to replace plastic with another material, such as glass or Tetra Pak. However, as I'm sure you'll hear from other speakers from things like Highland Spring, for example, this isn't as sustainable as it seems, because glass, for example, is much heavier than plastic, meaning that more carbon dioxide is released in its transport. And Tetra Pak is made up of sandwich layers of aluminium, cardboard, and plastic, meaning that it can be really hard to recycle. So it's not just as easy as saying, let's swap out plastic for another material, or at least not at the moment. Bioplastic is also, sometimes looked to as a natural plastic alternative, including by companies like Coke. But unfortunately, bioplastics aren't as good as they sound because they are so similar to normal plastic, but they are often put for recycling with them when bioplastics are actually classed as contaminants in the recycling process. And despite being classed as compostable, bioplastics can only be broken down in specific conditions in industrial composters and take a long time to break down in the environment, like their petroleum plastic counterparts. So, as individuals, the best thing we can do is to try and reduce plastic consumption where we can. So what we try and promote through our charity is for people to become plastic clever and to stop using plastic bottles, cups and lids, bags and straws, and just use reusable items instead. Now, it might seem like small changes like these can have a really minimal impact on the planet, but actually these items are in the top 10 of ocean pollutants for a reason. We use a lot of them. So imagine the impact that millions of people swapping a plastic bottle for a reusable one would have. Collective change has a larger impact than you might imagine. And when it comes to getting companies to change, we can't underestimate the impact of consumer demand. If we stop buying plastic items where we can, companies will have to change or they'll just lose business. We also need to get governments, to put pressure on companies to take responsibility for their plastic waste. And this comes through taxes on plastic production for corporations or fines for not including recycled plastic in their packaging. I recently spoke to the distinguished professor of atmospheric science, Michael Mann, about tackling climate change and plastic. And he made a really excellent point that by allowing companies to produce such large amounts of plastic and atmospheric pollutants with very little to no financial punishment, we're basically allowing them to have the biggest tax cut ever. And this really isn't good enough. Globally, we need to elect and push for governments now that hold companies accountable to the waste that they produce. Now, a friend of ours who is a professor at Plymouth University had a really good analogy for our plastic waste crisis. If plastic pollution were an overflowing bathtub, then the solution wouldn't be to just mop up the spilling water as it flows over all the edges. The solution would be to turn off the tap. And that's exactly what we need to do. We need to cut our plastic consumption at the source and turn off the plastic tap. So thank you very much for listening.
Amy, thank you very much. Very informative talk. Thank you indeed. And also to Doug. Now's an opportunity to ask any questions of either of our speakers. Rather than turning on your microphones, I'd ask that you type your questions in the public chat area where you're saying your thank yous. And Doug and Amy will do their utmost to answer any questions that you may have.
Shall I answer the first one I've noted on there? What do you recommend we buy from Alexander? What do you recommend we buy instead of plastics? I think, you know, we just need to be sensible, like Amy was saying, about the type of plastics we're buying. It's the if we're buying non-recyclable and disposable single-use products, that's when we have problems, really. I think so. We just have to be selective, and you know, it's a journey for all of us. We can't, you know, just change overnight. But I think we just all need to be sensible, and you know, perhaps nudge our relatives and friends when we go shopping as well, to you know, perhaps suggest they go for either a recyclable plastic bottle or cut out the plastic bags. And it's also about being prepared. You know, like I've got my bags in the car when I go shopping, just so I'm ready. You know, there's many of the time that I've forgotten myself. So, you know, it's a journey, but I think it's a constant thinking about what we're buying the whole time.
If it's okay, I'll take a couple of the other ones that I think link quite closely together. So there's ones from Elise and Savan, which are basically about, have governments implemented any policies to restrict plastic pollution, and what are the steps to do that as well? So I would say there have been some steps. I mean, some countries around the world have done really, you know, really drastic ones. Well, that sounds quite negative, but they've taken big steps, such as doing things like banning plastic bags, which obviously have a really big immediate impact. In the UK, there have been some some sort of ideas put out there to do things like tax plastic and to hold companies accountable to the amount that they produce. And there was obviously the bans that were brought in recently on straws, stirrers, etc. But the problem is that often these are delayed. So coronavirus hasn't helped with this as well. The tax has been delayed. And actually what we've been doing as a family is collecting all of the plastic that we've used that is unavoidable since the tax was delayed, just to show how much impact just a few years has. So we have seen some ideas out there, but ultimately we need to see more, and they need to be more urgent as well.
Thanks, Amy. There's a question from Jan. What are the alternatives for buying water/liquids if glass and Tetra Paks aren't that good either? Yeah, it's a long-term change that we're going for, and there are ways. I mean, there are a number of shops now. You can take your original plastic bottle and have it refilled, and refilling is going to be quite a big thing. A lot of companies supermarkets have started doing this refilling for various products, including cereals and things like that, and particularly liquids. We get our washing up liquids from. We take the plastic bottles or larger bottles back down, or glass bottles down to a local shop, and they refill it. But it is a big change in the way we have to behave to do things like that, really.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you just said for that, Doug. I think that ultimately we need to look at reusables as the solution to plastic, really, because ultimately the amount of plastic that we're using, or any material, is pretty unsustainable. So it's not as easy as just swapping out materials. I think it's okay if I take the question from Selena, which is about what is the difference between a 100% recyclable plastic bottle and a normal plastic bottle, and how do you make a 100% recyclable plastic bottle? So in theory, most plastic bottles are actually recyclable. The difference is that they're not recycled. And the reason for that is, like I said, it's, companies don't have financial incentives. There's things like product aesthetics, where a recycled plastic bottle is perhaps slightly off-colored compared to a completely clear, pristine plastic bottle, which is one of the reasons that, they're not used. And ultimately, if the plastic was actually in a closed loop infrastructure where it's collected, shredded down, melted, transported, remade into new bottles, which is the general recycling process, then that would be much, much better than what's currently happening. However, the reason why most plastics generally aren't recycled is because, as I mentioned, they are single use, which means that they're often really flimsy. They're like the films that we see on things, which are really, they're so, when you feel them, they feel so light, and that's because they are so low grade that it's really hard to recycle them. So that's another reason why plastics generally aren't recycled. But actually, I think it's a really good question, and also it's one we should be putting to these companies. And I think, if I'm correct in saying this, you're having a lecture from someone from Highland Spring, for example, in the future, and these are the exact questions that we should be putting to them: of why aren't you using 100% recycled plastic in your bottles? And we really need to be holding these companies to account for that as well. But it's a really good question.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, shall I answer Jack's question and leave you then to answer Rachel's? Mm-hmm. Jack says, what materials should large companies such as Coca-Cola use instead of plastic for their products? Well, I think Amy's just explained something about recycling, but I think sustainability means that we really shouldn't be using these plastic bottles at all. In Western countries where water supply is very clean and very healthy, why do we need these disposable plastic bottles? Because of the potential problems they're going to cause us. We just don't need them, and I think we need to change how we behave, really. And I think that's the answer, really. We need to have a more sustainable source of water, which is from the tap. Amy.
Definitely, I agree with you there. Rachel, the question about getting young people involved and empowering them and how they can make a difference. I think that a really important part of it is collaboration. And if there are young people, for example, who are interested in the school, really help them to take that forward and support them, and actually properly listen to them as well. I think that's something that from my experience as a youth activist in particular, actually making sure that we listen to young people and their suggestions, because they can have some really, really great ideas. And also what we really try and advocate through our Plastic Clever Schools program that we run through our charity is about collaboration between teachers and students. It shouldn't be something that is, pushed upon students by teachers of having to reduce plastic, and it's something that they don't really understand and then really aren't motivated to do. And actually, it shouldn't be something as well that is pushed for by students but not really listened to by teachers. So I think that would be my advice on that, and also looking where you can to implement issues like plastic into the curriculum. I know it's really hard. Both my parents are teachers, so we're very aware that it's difficult because the education system really isn't tailored enough towards environmental issues as it should be. But I think trying as much as possible to help and support young people to learn more about these issues and then help take it further as well through collaboration, I would say, is a really important point. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Amy. Shall I take Harry's question? If there are lots of microplastics in water supplies, how do we stop these when the infrastructure is not able to do this? I think with the work of Amy's charity, she's obviously doing a lot of work with the manufacturers of textiles, and that's where it needs to stop, really. They need to find solutions there, and perhaps less plastics in textiles as well as time goes on. Perhaps more natural products we should be incorporating into our clothes. And I think there are other things that we can do, like, for example, I think there's machines that there are filters that you can put in washing machines as well to take out textile fibers. But I mean, the answer is not to have so many in the first place, or to have them bound into the clothes themselves.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Doug says there. I think that ultimately with a lot of these issues, like when it comes to, for example, clearing up plastic that's already in the environment, we need to stop it at the source to begin with before we look at trying to clear it up as well. But I would say that, especially with clothing, so with microfibers, getting washing machine manufacturers to actually put filters built into their machines is also a really important point. It's really hard to retrofit things like filters for microfibers. And actually, by getting these companies to make it a standard as part of their machines, it actually prevents a lot of that, of any fibers really from our clothes getting into the environment. So I would also say that's something that we're trying to work to push for as well, but it's something that should be bear in mind. And I think that links to Jack's question as well, which is removing plastic and microfibers. So like myself and Doug have said, prevention is the most important point, but there are currently methods of clearing up plastics, for example, like the Ocean Cleanup Campaign, which is really worth checking out. And there's also other initiatives that are being developed to remove plastic. And with microfibers, there's actually some really amazing ideas coming from young people as well, such as one of the winners of the Google Science Fair a couple of years ago was about using electrostatic and magnets to remove microfibers and plastics from the water. So there were some really, really incredible ideas like that, which I definitely recommend looking into because they are really inspiring, and actually coming from young people as well, which is something that's inspiring to hear as a young person myself. Doug, if it's okay, I'll take the question below that as well, since that's...
Yeah, thanks. And I'll take Magnus's difficult question.
Yeah, so I would just say about the obstacle for running the charity, I kind of have touched on it already. I think that one of the most frustrating things, especially as a young person, is not being properly listened to, being used as a token voice, which I'm sure most young activists you speak to will agree on that. We really need to properly listen to the ideas that young people have, because I think they are really important. And then I would also say that urgency is another really big obstacle, especially when it comes to companies, governments. We see so many initiatives to address plastic, to tackle climate change, coming into effect in sort of the 2040s, the 2050s. And especially as young people, that's something that really hits home because, you know, we're going to be middle-aged adults by then. That's quite scary, and it really hits home for us as well. So we really need to see more young people properly involved in panels, in boards, actually included as advisors to companies and governments as well. And I would say that that's one of the biggest obstacles we face, but hopefully something that's going to change with the number of young people that are getting involved with these issues.
Thanks, Amy. Magnus poses a really difficult question. Making the leap from one-time plastic bottles in countries where the water is safe to drink is one thing, but what solution do you propose in countries where the water is contaminated? Well, I guess it comes, the answer, I guess, if our water was contaminated here, the answer wouldn't be solving the problem with plastic bottles. The real problem would be to be able to provide clean, drinkable, potable water for people. Now, I know in a lot of developed countries, undeveloped countries, developing countries, it's difficult and it's a long-term project. But because plastics are so ubiquitous, they'll carry around the whole world. It's a world problem. It's a world health problem, if anything. That we should be trying to provide clean tap water around the world for every country. And the answer is not plastic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a very difficult question. So yeah, I agree, and also that's exactly why we shouldn't be. I feel like there's a lot of finger pointing when it comes to plastic as well. Like the amount of times I've heard of things, like, oh, China produces this amount of plastic or greenhouse gas emissions, or other nations, and ultimately just we can't be finger pointing when things like, in the UK, we produce so many plastic bottles of water when we don't need to as well. So I know that doesn't really directly answer your question, but I think Doug gave a really good answer to that. But that's another thing I think we need to bear in mind. To answer the question below that about plastic bags and paper bags and how bans can actually almost cause a negative impact with things like other materials producing, for example, more greenhouse gases. I would say that is exactly why we need to be careful that these bans don't just cause plastic to be replaced with other materials, and why the emphasis really needs to be put on reusables, because almost every material will have some kind of negative impact on the environment, especially due to the amount of them that we produce. So that's why it is not as easy as saying, let's just replace plastic with paper, because then also you need to get paper from somewhere, which can lead to deforestation if it's not done correctly, etc. So it is very difficult to just replace plastic with another material, which is why putting the emphasis on reusable alternatives is the best way to go with it. And we also need to be really careful when it comes to bans as well, that we're not negatively impacting people who, for example, rely on items like plastic straws if they've got a medical condition. So we also need to be aware in making sure that our bans are inclusive of everyone in society as well.
I think you should, thanks, Amy. I think you should take the next one as well and respond to that one.
Sorry, is that the one about pressuring governments? Is that what you mean?
No, Rachel's. Thank you, Amy.
Oh, Rachel. Oh, sorry, I just missed that one. Thank you, Rachel, as well. And yeah, that sounds great. I'm just trying to read this while I'm thinking. Yeah, and obviously, if anyone wants to get in touch with us about getting schools involved, that would be amazing. We're trying to reach as many schools as possible, and we've already got some interest around the world. And if we can support in any way, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us, and we'd be more than happy to hear from you.
Thanks, Amy. And I'll take Tamana's question. What are some ways we can pressure governments into helping with plastic and climate change? Good question for Greenpeace activists, because Greenpeace does this every day. We have 100 or so people working at head office in London. We've got offices all around the world. And because we are non-violent and we provide solutions, governments listen to us. So that's one way. You can join and help Amy's charity, and there are other charities as well. But also talk to your councils, talk to your MP, get your parents to talk to the MPs, get the noise going, make the noise, and spread the word.
Definitely agree with you there. And yeah, I think Greenpeace and other really major environmental organisations have had a really influential impact on governments already through that as well. So yeah, I agree with Doug there. And there's another couple of questions here. I think if we start now, how long will it take to the world to make an actual change on the levels of plastic pollution? I think it's a very good question. I think ultimately, if we stop producing plastic right now, that would have a good immediate impact, because obviously we're producing much less plastic waste. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a while to recover the environment, for example, with the amount of plastic that is out there. But the only way that we can start to do that is if we start to reduce consumption in the first place. It's like the overflowing bathtub I talked about. You know, it's going to have a lag effect, but ultimately we need to turn off the tap before we start to mop it all up as well. So I think it's a really good question. I think we'll have to see if the action that we take globally is urgent enough to address plastic pollution now as well. Doug, I don't know if you have anything to add on that before I answer the last question.
No, I'll let you answer the last one, but I'd just like to say there are some excellent questions there, and I wish everyone luck, and thank you for listening to myself and Amy.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. There were some really amazing questions there. And just to quickly, I know we're running out of time, but just for the last question, we have a Plastic Clever Schools initiative, which is directly for schools. It's tailored for schools. It's got loads of resources. So if you head over to our website, you can find out more about the initiative there as well. But agreeing with Doug, thank you for the amazing questions and for being a really great audience.
Amy, Doug, thank you very much for your input. Very informative. I will touch on one point that Amy raised, and that is about us old folk and the importance that young people have. And that is actually a very valid point. It's one of the reasons we're running these debates. It's your future, whether it be plastics or any of the other subjects that we're touching upon. The young people are what the future is all about, and it's down to you chaps to understand both sides of the equation. And that came across very well today, I have to say, that it wasn't anti-plastics, it's how we deal with our plastics, that some plastics are important. And understanding that is extremely important. So thank you very much for that. I know that next week, and Amy's touched upon this a few times, Highland Springs will be doing the lecture next week, which will be number 3 of 4 lectures. A number of schools have asked about the allocation of teams, whether you'll be pro or against the abolition of plastics. That won't be announced until the end of the 4th debate, and that's done so quite deliberately to make sure that you listen to both sides of the argument. Also come mid-April, the timetable for next year will also be coming out, where we're introducing 5 more debates, as well as expanding on the mock court program as well. So in closing, Amy and Doug, I very much appreciate your input this evening, and also very much appreciate the quality of questions. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you.